Hi, welcome to my first video, my first sewing instructional video. It's on learning how to make a mask. I'm using a pattern which I found online. I'll put a link to it below so that you have the pattern links that I used. This particular pattern comes with a man size, a teenage and woman size, a young kid size, and a small child size. In addition, you'll also need this nose piece, which is 2 inches by 6 inches. You'll use that same size one for each of the masks. Some of the other supplies you might need for this project are a rotary cutter. You'll need some sharp tip scissors for doing some trimming. You'll need a marker for tracing around your patterns. You may want a chalk pencil for tracing on your interfacing. You'll need some pins and a ruler and a cutting mat. Okay, for cutting out the fabric, you're going to cut your main fabric out of some sort of cotton weave, and your lining can be out of something else. I'm choosing to use muslin here because they have a large amount of muslin on hand. And in watching one video, I did learn that the hospitals are wanting 2 different colors. I think that's for the other style mask, but I'm not really sure. I decided that it would just help my pretty fabric go a little farther. So I'm going to start by tracing around my pattern, and I'm just using a regular marker here. Nothing fancy about this. So that's your main fabric. And your lining piece. Now for this portion, I'm just going to freehand cut around here. That may be a little awkward for some people. You may want to just use your regular scissors for that. And we'll do the same thing for the lining. Now, for cutting out this nose piece, it's important that you understand a little bit about fabric. The other portions of the mask we cut out with the grain of the fabric. With this nose piece, you're going to want to cut this out on the bias or the diagonal. You're going to want this at about a 45-degree angle. I actually have one of those on my cutting mat here, if you can see that. So I'm lining my fabric up, squared up with the fabric, and then I'm trying to keep that approximately on the bias line. The reason for that is if it's cut on the bias, you're going to have a little bit of stretch to that piece that you're not going to have if you cut it with the grain of the fabric. So that is pretty important for this. This piece, the nose piece, I don't believe this was included in the original pattern. I'm not exactly sure why. You can see how this gets a little bit of stretch, and that's going to be important as we place this around the bridge of the nose inside the mask. Okay, for this part we're going to be cutting out with the main fabric pattern piece, we're going to be cutting out some interfacing. This interfacing that I'm using is very lightweight. You can see that it's fusible interfacing, so we're going to need 2 pieces of that, which we will fuse to the back of the main portion of the mask. So for the interfacing, I'm going to use my chalk pencil because it shows up a little bit better on this. We'll just trace this off. and then we'll cut it with the rotary cutter. And like I said earlier, you don't need to use your metal ruler guide. It can be helpful if you're just learning how to use a rotary cutter. Okay, so our next step is we're going to take this interfacing over to the ironing board, and we're going to iron this on the back of our main fabric piece. Okay, so now I'm at my ironing board, and I have my main mask piece. This is the front of the mask, and I have my interfacing here. What I'm going to do is just open this up so that I have the wrong side of the fabric, or for this particular pattern that's a batik fabric, it doesn't really matter too much which side is the right side or the wrong side. I'm going to take my interfacing pieces, and I'm going to put them on the wrong side of the fabric, and I'm just going to iron these on. So once you have the interfacing ironed on the wrong side, you're going to put them right sides together. We're going to take this over to the sewing machine, and we're going to do a seam down this side. Okay, so at this point I'm at my sewing machine, and I'm going to sew this curved edge. I'm going to do a 1/4 inch seam. You don't really need to backstitch here because you're going to come back again around another time and secure those stitching lines, so it's not necessary. And you can just go right off the edge. Going to add my lining piece here. I'm going to do the same thing, going down the curved edge of the lining piece at about a 1/4 inch. Okay. Okay, for this nose piece, I'm going to give this a quick press before I start working with it. And for this piece, we're going to iron down the short ends about a 1/4 inch. After you iron it down like that, then you're going to fold the piece in half the long way, and you're going to iron it again. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to trim this seam a little bit closer to the edge. We'll do it on both the outer part of the mask and the lining. I usually just trim about half of that seam allowance off, so I'm taking my 1/4 inch seam allowance down to about 1/8 inch. Okay, the next step is to give these a quick press. This probably isn't completely necessary. To be honest, I don't do this when I'm making masks in great production, but it can help to just iron that seam open a little bit. This is really the inside of the mask, so it'll stay like this. This one, the mask will open up, and this will be the outer part of the mask. Now, on the original pattern, the lady goes back and she top stitches this area. I personally don't really find that that's necessary. I'm not too concerned about this seam in here flipping out, and really it's just creating extra hole and extra stitching in the masks, which I don't really think is probably the greatest idea anyway. So just give that a quick press so that you can get a nice smooth seam when you have a finished product. Okay, at this point we're going to prepare the nose piece for sewing into the inner part of the mask. We're going to sew down this edge, and we're going to sew down this edge. I would say this is probably the second most tricky part of the mask, not because it's difficult to actually sew, so much, but it's just that these little things just tend to want to get eaten up in your sewing machine. So actually sometimes what I do is I start with this little charger piece of fabric, sew a straight line down to there, then butt this right up in there. You're going to want to sew as close to the edge as possible. Then you can do the exact same thing to the other end. This time we'll do it without the charging piece and we'll see what happens. Because I'm using the batik fabric, it seems to go a little bit better. But if you're just using regular quilter's cotton, you may find that the needle's just pressing your fabric right down into the machine. And so that can be a little bit tricky to work with. So at this point, our nose piece is ready to get pinned to the inner lining. Okay, so now we have the inner lining and we have our nose piece ready. The next thing is you're going to take your nose piece, fold it in half, and place a pin there. That marks the center of the nose piece. You're going to line that up with the raw edge of the top of your lining. I recommend putting your pins in the downward direction here. You're going to work to the left side. You're going to line this up. Because we've cut this nose piece on the bias, it has a little give to it. We're going to line that up like that. And we're going to line this end up as well. We'll place a pin there. After you get that part lined up, then go ahead and pin the other side of the mask. So now you've got 5 pins holding the nose piece to the lining. This next part is the second most tricky part of the project. We're not actually going to sew along this raw edge yet. That will come later, but we're actually going to start here. We're going to sew very close to the edge, as close to the edge as we can, the whole way over to the end here. You are going to want to backstitch this area. Okay, we've brought the lining and the nose piece over to the machine. We're going to turn it and we're going to start sewing here at this edge. I'm going to line that up. There's a red mark on my sewing machine. I'd say I'm sewing as close to the edge as I can get, maybe like a 1/16 away from the edge. I will backstitch here. And I'm going to leave these pins in place. Make sure you don't sew over them so as you don't break a needle. You can just pull them back slightly, but you're going to want to leave those in place for the next step of the project. So just go ahead and sew. You can kind of just sew straight for a little while, but then as you near the center where the seam is, you're going to have to ease your sewing and kind of twist this along. Once you get it through that middle part, it gets a little easier. It's going to be straightening out. Come down to the end, do some back stitching again, and you can cut it loose from your machine. Okay, we're going to be hemming this side and this side of the inner lining. We needed to get rid of these raw edges, so we're going to turn this over. We're going to iron back about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch. And we're going to fold it over again. We'll do that on both sides. Alright, I've brought my lining over to the sewing machine and I'm going to zigzag this edge. I want my one side of my zigzag to start right here at this edge of the fabric and then to extend over into this area, but I want to make sure that I keep it kind of close to that folded edge. There's no need to backstitch here, as you'll be coming back later and you can secure these edges. like that. We'll do that to both sides. Okay, now we're going to take these two pieces, the lining piece with the nose section and the front piece of the mask. We're going to pin them together, right sides together. We're going to match up this center seam with this center seam. And since we left the pins in from before, they're right in place to just go ahead and pin right there, lining up your two center seams. Again, we'll go down the left side of the mask and then we'll go back and pin the right side. And I am going to add one extra pin here. So you can see from this angle, I'm making these edges all flush. Got about 5 layers of material here at this point. Okay, we'll be taking this over to the sewing machine and we will start here. We'll sew up and around the nose and back down. Then we're going to come back and we're going to sew along this bottom as well. I don't find it's necessary to pin that. I just line up these center seams and I start sewing here and sew down to this side. I'm going to keep my seam allowance about somewhere between 1/4 and 3/8 at this point. You can come back after that, after the sewing, you can come back and cut away any excess that may be keeping your mask from lying nice and flat. Okay, I'm going to line my sewing machine up where the lining starts. You're going to have to guide this along this curved seam. This is probably the trickiest part of this pattern. You will want to backstitch here. And this time you can take out your pins as you go. And when we get to this end, we again are going to want to backstitch. Now for this side, just line up these center seams. You can hold those in place, but you're going to want to start down at the end of the lining again, backstitching again. And I would say keep it about 1/4 to 3/8 inch seam again. You'll pivot here slightly at the middle. And backstitch again at the end. Once you get this part done, you're going to want to go back, trim off all these stray strings. And now, for this part, before you turn this, you can do a little bit of seam clipping here. Maybe 3 on that side, 3 on this side, being careful not to snip into your stitching. You can do the same thing up here at this end. I like to do 2 snips kind of close to that center seam. 2 along there, 2 along here. And then go down to this area where you have an inner curve. Give it a couple snips there. You could actually trim this close to the seam if you wanted. I think I did that in some of my earlier masks, but I find it's really not necessary. At this point, you're going to want to turn this whole thing inside out. Then you can take this over to the ironing board for some ironing. Alright, so at this point we're going to do a little bit of ironing to prepare our mask for the last step of sewing. Once you get done with that sewing and it's all turned inside out, you can find your edge. I don't really know how else to explain that. And up here, do the same thing. With this batik fabric, this really isn't very hard to do at all. So you could probably proceed from here without ironing, but I like to give it a little press at this point, just to crisp up that edge. And along the bottom as well. Now, this part is something that I changed from the original pattern. This little wing that's sticking out here is going to become the casing. So you're going to iron this edge down about 1/4 of an inch, and this edge as well. And you can see how I've tapered it in a little bit. I actually do that intentionally because it does help to get this to be placed just right. Then we're going to turn this in maybe about 1/4 of an inch. Then we're going to turn this in a second time, leaving it closer to 3/8 or 1/2 of an inch. This is what we're going to be sticking our lacing through. These masks are going to tie on. So we're going to do that on both sides. I'll show you again. I'm going to allow this to taper down. I'm going to fold this one up just at a very slight angle. You can see when you do that, then when you fold this step in, it just helps these corners to be kind of nice and neat. Now, I think it would be easiest if I demonstrate the stitching technique at this point here, where you can see pretty easily. I'm going to start stitching here, right here in this little ditch between the casing and my pocket lining. I'm going to start stitching here. I'm going to back stitch, and I'm going to edge stitch right along this edge the whole way up around the nose piece and then down to this side. Then once I get to here, I'm going to cross over that ditch. I'm going to pivot my needle, and I'm actually going to sew down along this green edge, not the muslin edge. It's important at this point that you make sure that you're on this green casing edge, and you want to do some back stitching here and here because this part of the mask is going to endure a lot of wear and tear because of the tie. If you sew on this muslin edge, essentially you're going to sew your pocket closed, and then that kind of defeats the purpose of having a pocket. So we'll sew down here, we'll go off this edge, we'll pivot here, and then we'll go straight across the bottom. And we'll do that same technique over here. We're going to go across the ditch. Once we get onto the green fabric, we're going to go up to this edge, do some good back stitching here and here, and then that's where we're going to be back at the beginning again. So we'll take this over to the machine now, and we'll set that up. Okay, so here we are at the machine. I'm going to have my needle go down right there in between those two fabrics. Go forward a few stitches, reverse, forward again. You can see I'm about 1/16 of a way from the edge, just doing a top stitching. Now this part here, your fabric's a little thick at this point. Okay, so remember here we're going to cross over onto the green fabric, put your needle down, pivot, And this is where you want to do a little extra back stitching so that this part of the mask is nice and secure. And just continue down the side of the casing so you get to the other end. Do some good back stitching here again. Put your needle down and pivot so that you can do this side. We're just edge stitching here again. Pivot at the center. Okay, so you're going to allow your stitching to cross over into the green casing fabric. Put the needle in the down position and pivot. Good back stitching here again. Good back stitching here. And you can just go off the edge. That's the end. So now just snip all your stray threads and you're done with the sewing portion of your mask. What I'm using for my ties of my masks is this cotton twill tape. This came from a factory outlet probably about 30 years ago. I paid $4, or rather my mom did, for an entire spool of it. I've made like 25 masks and I still can't even tell I've used any of it. So you're going to take your bodkin and attach it to the end of your cotton twill tape. Measure your cotton twill tape for a man's or woman's size mask. Make it about 56 inches long. We're going to go in the bottom and out. Nope, I messed that up. You're going to go in from the top and out the bottom. Then we're going to go up the other side and out the top. Now you'll want to pull this through until both sides are even. This creates a loop at the bottom. This will go around the bottom of the neck. That'll allow you to have room at the top to tie this over the top of your head. You can tie a knot at the ends of the cotton twill tape. Trim off the ends to prevent fraying. Then, this is what I'm using for the nose piece. This is a 12-inch pipe cleaner, cut in half, and then I turn the ends under, like this, and like this. You can take this and insert it into the nose piece pocket. So you can get a nice tight fit around the nose. You're probably going to want to remove that nose piece for washing. You can wash that out by hand. I wash my entire mask out by hand at the end of wear, and I take my nose piece out and I wash that as well. So, as far as putting a filter in your mask goes, you've got this pocket here in which you can insert a filter. Doing a lot of research online, I found one recommendation for filters are these blue shop towels. If you fold the towel in half, you can create a double thickness, which is what was recommended, and can create a template like that. I drew this off and then I took it back to my sewing machine and I did a stitching around the outside of my mask. Then I cut this out with scissors. Since you don't have one of these in your kit, basically just come back and lay out your mask like this, trying to create the shape of the mask. It is a little bit tricky to fit the filter up in around this nose piece, and you can experiment with how that best works for you.